please take heed of what you've done and confess.
And now
I held her in my arms. She was alive.
Now, why did you shoot her in the head?
Because I was trying to finish the job.
On June 29, 2017, in Palm Beach County, Florida, a pregnant entrepreneur and mother of three named Macka Jenkins was shot to death in her own bedroom while she slept. The bullet struck her head from roughly 2 feet away. Within minutes, the whole community knew something had happened. At first, her husband, Yuri Jenkins, told police and reporters a heartbreaking story about a masked robber who'd broken into the house in the middle of the night.
I held her in my arms. She was alive.
On camera, he looked like a man destroyed by grief, and his story was convincing enough to draw sympathy from an entire state. In reality, he had arranged for his own wife's murder to collect a $500,000 insurance payout, a payout he wasn't even named to receive.
Now, why did you shoot her in the head?
Because I was trying to finish the job.
What pushed the husband to have his own wife killed, and what it cost him in the end, that's what we're breaking down in this video. Macka Sakenya Harold was born August 9, 1983 in Belle Glade, Palm Beach County, Florida. Her grandmother, Gloria Harold, raised her, stepping into the role of mother from her earliest years. Relatives who knew the family remembered a rare charisma in Macka even as a child. In school, she stood out. She was voted homecoming queen, always surrounded by friends, and the adults around her described a girl with a fierce sense of self-respect and a stubborn drive to get what she wanted. Family members recalled that Macka combined ambition with warmth in a way that wasn't common. She could make friends in almost any room, but from a young age, she also carried a clear picture of the life she wanted as an adult. Her own business, a stable family, financial independence. Palm Beach County, where she grew up, wasn't a place where that kind of ambition came easy. She'd watched plenty of people around her get sentenced to hard circumstances for life. According to those close to her, Macka decided early on that her story was going to go a different way. After high school, she enrolled at the University of South Florida. During one of her first semesters, she found out she was pregnant. Her daughter, Senya, was born not long after. A lot of young mothers in her position would have dropped out. Macka didn't. She finished her bachelor's degree, then went on to earn a master's, raising a child alone the entire time while juggling motherhood and school. Her brother later said she was a phenomenal mom, that she and Senya were basically best friends. In 2013 and 2014, Macka's family went through a period of homelessness. She rarely talked about the details publicly afterward, keeping it to vague references about a hard stretch of life she'd had to push through. What's known is this. That's the exact point where she started building a business from nothing. 2 years later, in 2015, her income hit 6 figures.
She was an entrepreneur. She was that. I'm an entrepreneur, and we just clicked together.
By 2017, she was earning well beyond that. She owned a consulting company, the Prime Enterprise Group, helping entrepreneurs and small business owners build out business plans and marketing strategies. The whole operation was built on her own story. She coached and mentored clients using her own path from poverty to financial independence as the blueprint. Most of her clients were just like she'd once been. No starting capital, but an idea and a willingness to work. For a lot of them, Macka was living proof that the jump from temporary housing to a real sustainable business could happen in years, not decades. As her business grew, so did her family's standing in the community. People who'd known Macka during the homeless years now watched her running a company with an office, a client roster, and a growing name in local business circles. That transformation didn't go unnoticed. Neighbors and acquaintances started treating her less like someone they knew and more like a success story, one worth telling. She turned that journey into part of her personal brand. On social media, Macka regularly posted motivational content, telling her followers about her climb from homelessness to steady income. In one video, she told her audience not to give up, to remember why they'd started their business in the first place. Her page became a kind of highlight reel of success, including, at times, photos showing exact numbers from her bank account. On New Year's Eve heading into 2009, at a church celebration, Macka met a 23-year-old barber named Yuri Jenkins, a pastor's son. He was charming, the kind of person who could win someone over in the first few minutes of conversation. Her friend Kimberly Wilson later remembered that Macka had always wanted to build a family, and meeting Yuri felt like a second shot at that after having her first daughter. According to Wilson, when Macka talked about that meeting, She had the biggest smile Wilson had ever seen on her. At the time, Yuri had a solid reputation in the community. A pastor's son, a working barber, someone plenty of church members had known since he was a kid. For Macka, who'd grown up without parents and spent her life building things mostly on her own, meeting someone from that kind of family may have felt like an extra layer of security, personal and social both. A few months after they met, Macka announced she was pregnant again. The couple had a son, and shortly after they were married in a church ceremony surrounded by family and friends, the same church where they'd first met a year earlier. At that point, it looked like Macka's life was finally coming together exactly the way she wanted. A husband, a family, growing kids, a future ahead of them. A few years in though, the marriage hit its first real crack. Macka found out Yuri had fathered a child with another woman during their marriage. For someone who'd spent her whole life building a sense of control over her own future, that discovery hit differently than any financial or day-to-day struggle she'd already learned to handle. Her brother said it broke her heart. She kicked Yuri out of the house. But the split wasn't permanent. Eventually, she took him back. Her friend Kim Wilson remembered that even after that betrayal, Macka never stopped believing she could hold her family together. Family meant too much to her to walk away over one painful mistake, no matter how much it hurt. After they reconciled, Yuri got involved in his wife's business, helping run the Prime Enterprise Group, and the company started thriving. The family's standard of living improved, and not long after, they had another child. According to Wilson, Macka told her during this period that everything finally felt like it was falling into place. The family, the business, the stability she'd wanted. From the outside, it looked like a comeback story, a couple that had survived infidelity and separation, come back together, and started a new chapter. But in the spring of 2017, tension crept back into the relationship. In May, Macka filed for divorce. There's no official reason on record for that decision, but the filing itself signals the marriage had hit another breaking point, one just as serious as the one years earlier. She withdrew the petition almost immediately after learning she was pregnant with their fourth child. A mutual friend of the couple later testified that Yuri didn't react to the pregnancy news with any joy. He was displeased, a reaction that stood in sharp contrast to what you'd expect from a man learning his family was about to grow. At that point, Yuri's finances were in bad shape. He still owed roughly $20,000 in unpaid child support to the woman he'd had an affair with, and his income as a barber wasn't close to covering a debt that size on any reasonable timeline. Macka, meanwhile, held a $500,000 life insurance policy, enough to wipe out most of his financial problems in one shot and completely change his situation.
How about that?
Honestly, everybody can go to hell. My wife was a good wife. She was a good mom.
Laid out in order, these facts raise questions that still don't have clean answers. Was Macka's decision to file for divorce in May tied to new suspicions about her husband cheating again? Or was it something else? Financial friction that had built up over years? Why did news of a fourth pregnancy pull her back? Was it attachment, a sense of obligation to the child on the way, or maybe an emotional dependency built up over years of forgiving him? And how did Yuri see the moment? As one more chance to save the marriage, or as a shrinking window to escape a financial hole he'd dug for himself? History doesn't give a clear answer to any of it. What's known is that the pattern in this relationship kept repeating: betrayal, separation, forgiveness, a fresh start. That cycle, built up over years of marriage, left Macka in a vulnerable position, returning again and again to someone who'd already broken her trust once, trusting that the lesson had finally stuck. There's another angle worth looking at here too. By 2017, the roles in this relationship had clearly shifted from where they started. In the early years, Yuri had been seen as the stable one, a pastor's son with a solid reputation in the community. By the time of the murder, Macka was the one bringing in the money and the status. Her business was growing. People recognized her. She was held up as an example to follow. Yuri was still a barber, still carrying debt to an ex-girlfriend. Whether that shift in the balance of power affected the relationship is a question without a direct answer, but it's one that comes up naturally once you line up the facts. There's one more detail worth noting, something that only came to light after the murder, but that connects directly to what was happening in the spring of 2017. About a month before Macka was killed, one of her insurance policies was modified. On its own, changing the terms of an insurance policy is a routine administrative step that happens for all kinds of reasons. But in light of what came next, a detail that barely registered at the time takes on an entirely different meaning. Before we go further, if this case has your attention, hit that like button. It tells us these are the stories worth telling. Subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation, and drop a comment. What's your read on this case so far? Now back to it. The evening of June 28, 2017, at the Jenkins home in the Lake Worth Lantana area started out like any other weeknight. The house sat in a quiet suburb locals just call Lantana, the kind of place where nothing on the surface suggested what was coming.
It's everything about her. The conversations with her. She just was a person, the kind of person you would never want to go and live with.
Inside were Macka, Yuri, their 3 kids, and Macka's brother Key, and that night looked no different from dozens before it. Around 11:24 p.m., some accounts put it slightly later, closer to midnight, Macka posted on social media a post that would later become the focus of intense scrutiny from both journalists and investigators. In it, she talked about her journey from homelessness in 2013 and 2014 to 6-figure earnings in 2015 and multiple 6 figures by the time she was writing the post. She attached a photo of a $20,000 bank deposit from a client. Afterward, she stayed online for a while, responding to comments based on available records that lasted until roughly 12:30 a.m. It was the last known activity from Macka Jenkins before she went to bed. Just over an hour passed between the moment she last engaged with her followers online and the moment a gunshot rang out. That night, the house held Macka, Yuri, their 3 children, ages 1, 7, and 13, and Macka's brother, Key. Before the night was over, 2 more people would show up. People, as far as anyone in the family knew, no one was expecting. The rest of that night has been pieced together almost entirely from the accounts of the people who survived it and the technical evidence investigators collected. No outside witness, no one from the street, no neighbor appears anywhere in this timeline. Everything known about that night comes exclusively from the people who were inside the house. Just before 2 a.m., Macka's brother, Key Greer, who lived with the family, left the house and drove to a 24-hour 7-Eleven. An ordinary run, the kind he'd probably made dozens of times before. While he was gone, 2 men pulled up to the house, Dimitri Dale in a white Dodge Charger, and Jovan Joseph. What exactly happened at the house during those minutes he was gone isn't known for certain. Key was at the store and couldn't have seen it. How long Dale's car sat outside before Key got back, and what was said between anyone during that window are details that have never been fully reconstructed. Quay got home around 2 a.m. The house had a garage set up as a working barbershop, a small home barbershop Yuri used for his trade. When Key walked in, Yuri insisted on cutting his hair right there. The 2 settled into the makeshift shop and the haircut began. Routine, unremarkable, something that had happened in that garage 100 times before. Mid-haircut, a man in a mask made from a t-shirt tied around his face burst into the garage, armed with a gun. How he got in, through an unlocked door, a broken lock, or some other way, isn't known from available information. It's one of the technical details that's never been fully explained. From what's known, his face was covered. Only his eyes were visible. He demanded money, repeating the question over and over without waiting for a real answer. Besides Yuri and Key, Dimitri Dale was also in the garage at that moment, the same man who'd just pulled up in the white Dodge Charger. The armed man forced all 3 of them, Yuri, Key, and Dale, upstairs to where Macka and the kids were sleeping. The second floor held the bedrooms, the kids' rooms, and the room Macka shared with Yuri, where she was asleep at that moment, pregnant, with no idea what was happening. What exactly was said, whether anyone tried to signal or warn Macka as the group climbed those stairs, can't be reconstructed from the available sources. Upstairs, Yuri asked the gunman to let Dale take the kids downstairs, away from what was happening. Strangely enough, the shooter agreed. That detail would later become one of the most debated in the entire case. An armed intruder who'd just broken into a stranger's home lets one of the people present walk off with the children. A person who, in theory, could have used that moment to call for help, run for the street, or otherwise blow up the whole plan. No source has ever explained the logic behind that decision. Once the kids were out of the room, Yuri and Key were forced face down on the floor. As far as anyone knows, that's where they stayed until the shot was fired. Unable to see what was happening in the bedroom, but hearing every bit of it, the gunman walked into the dark bedroom where Macka was sleeping. At the time, she was pregnant with her 4th child. How far along isn't specified in available sources. The distance between him and the sleeping woman, based on later estimates, was about 2 feet. The bullet hit her head. Only one shot was fired that night, no others. Blood was left on the wall above the headboard. A woman who, just hours earlier, had been posting online about her own success was shot in her sleep. She never even woke up to know what was happening in her own house. Right after the shot, the gunman left the house and fled in the white Dodge Charger. Where the car went in those first few minutes and how long it took before it was abandoned hasn't been established from available sources.
Peace tonight for a family who wanted to know who gunned down this mother of 3. A 19-year-old man is in custody.
At 2:17 a.m., the Lake Worth Police Department received 2 calls to 911. The first came from Key Greer. His voice, based on the recording, carried raw panic, demanding help arrive immediately because his sister was fighting for her life. A second call came in almost simultaneously. Exactly who made it isn't clear from available sources, but it was likely another adult in the house, someone other than Key. The fact that 2 calls landed at nearly the same moment, from the same address, at 2:17 in the morning, says something about how fast panic was spreading inside that house. From the shot to the first call, only a matter of minutes had passed. When paramedics arrived, Macka was still alive. She was rushed immediately to Delray Medical Center, the nearest facility equipped to handle a gunshot wound of that severity. The drive took only minutes, but the injury wasn't survivable. In the emergency room, doctors fought to save 2 lives at once, Macka's and the child she was carrying. Despite their efforts, she couldn't be saved. Macka Jenkins died at the hospital, along with the unborn child she'd been carrying at the moment of the shooting. No official time of death is recorded in available sources, but she was still alive when the first responders reached her, which gave her family a few minutes of hope on the way to the hospital, at least. In the first hours after it happened, the story looked simple. An armed robbery that ended in tragedy. Yuri Jenkins told police and reporters about a man in a mask breaking into the house with a gun, demanding money, and how he tried to protect his family but couldn't stop the fatal shot. For Palm Beach County Police, who started investigating within hours of the 911 calls, that version was the working theory at first. A random home invasion targeting a successful entrepreneur sounded plausible, especially given how openly the family had displayed their financial success online. On June 30th, 2017, just one day after his wife's death, Yuri sat down for an exclusive interview with CBS 12 reporter Thomas Forrester.
What are your thoughts right now? Is it, hit you?
It hit me.
On camera, he looked like a man wrecked by grief. He said he'd held his wife in his arms, that she was still alive in those moments, that he'd never forget it. He described Macka as a good wife, a good mother, a successful entrepreneur who'd built everything from nothing. Their interview spread across local news and set off a wave of sympathy for the widower and his kids. Within hours, the story of a young woman shot in her sleep at the height of her own success was being talked about far beyond Palm Beach County. Macka's family threw themselves into the public search for the supposed robber. Relatives appealed to the public for any information that might help and worked with the Palm Beach County Crime Stoppers line, coordinating anonymous tips from residents. In August, the family held a press conference, calling again on the community to come forward with anything they knew. By that point, nearly 2 months had passed since the murder, and whoever was responsible was still free. Yuri didn't show up to that event. His absence from a public push to find his own wife's killer didn't go unnoticed. When reporters asked Macka's grandmother, Gloria Harold, about it, she said the family had no idea where her granddaughter's husband was or what he was doing. Meanwhile, investigators were already starting to question the robbery theory in those first few days. Nothing was missing from the house, with one exception. A car later identified as belonging to Dale had been stolen, but none of the family's own belongings were touched. The shooter fired a single shot and made no attempt to search the house for anything of value. No jewelry, no cash, no electronics, which wasn't typical behavior for a robbery. Investigators who'd worked cases like this before knew that armed robbers who break into a home usually try to grab as much as they can, as fast as they can. Here, the whole thing came down to one shot in one bedroom. Yuri's own behavior drew particular attention from investigators. The lead detective on the case, Sean Oliver, later described his first sit-down with Yuri, saying that as an experienced investigator, something struck him as off. Yuri was joking around way more than you'd expect from a man whose wife had just been shot. That reaction stood in sharp contrast to the grieving husband image he'd put on for the cameras just a day later. For someone with years of experience investigating violent crime, that gap between private behavior and public performance was exactly the kind of red flag that demanded a closer look. Investigators weren't the only ones who noticed the contradiction. Local reporters and family acquaintances pointed out that not long after playing the grieving widower in public, Yuri showed up at a strip club. Hardly the behavior you'd expect from a man who just buried his pregnant wife. Even more telling was what investigators learned from Yuri's ex-girlfriend, the same woman he owed child support to. According to her, Yuri had kissed her the day before Macka was killed, and the day after his wife's death, propositioned her for sex, showing no visible emotion about what had just happened. Set side by side, the grieving widower on CBS 12 and the man acting like nothing had happened with his mistress painted two pictures that were increasingly hard to reconcile with the official version of events. A few weeks after the murder, another detail surfaced that tied directly into the financial motive investigators were already starting to suspect. Macka had a $500,000 life insurance policy, the exact amount that could wipe out Yuri's debt to his ex and completely turn his finances around. But a closer look at the paperwork revealed something unexpected. Yuri wasn't listed as the beneficiary at all. That role belonged to Macka's grandmother, Gloria Harold, the woman who'd raised her. If the murder really was committed for the insurance money, whoever was behind it apparently either never checked who was actually set to collect or was planning to get the money some other way. Through Gloria Harold herself, through pressure on the family, or through some route that's never been documented publicly. Whether Yuri knew his actual status on that policy before the murder, or only found out afterward alongside investigators, is a question that still doesn't have a clear answer.
A plea for answers from Macka Jenkins' family just a few weeks ago on what would have been her 34th birthday.
The first real break in the case came when the stolen white Dodge Charger turned up a quarter mile from the Jenkins house. It had been abandoned relatively close to the scene, closer than you'd expect from someone trying seriously to cover their tracks. Inside, investigators found a receipt from a restaurant called Miami Sub, dated June 29th, a small, seemingly careless detail that ended up giving them their first real lead. A check of the restaurant's surveillance footage showed Dimitri Dale there with another man, later identified as Jovan Joseph. Further review of surveillance footage from around the neighborhood showed Joseph's car trailing close behind Dale's Dodge Charger that night, heading toward the Jenkins home, a detail linking the two men well before either one had said a word to investigators. At first, Joseph denied any involvement at all, insisting he had nothing to do with the murder and didn't even know the Jenkins family. That changed when his cell phone records, the towers his phone connected to overnight on June 28th into 29th, confirmed he'd been right near the house at the time of the shooting. There was no point denying it any further. Key Greer himself played a key role in cracking the case open. He remembered that the voice and general build of the armed intruder reminded him of a friend Dale had brought over to play basketball on the afternoon of June 28th, just hours before the murder. That connection stayed buried for a while, partly because the shooter's face had been hidden behind a t-shirt mask, and a voice under that kind of stress sounds different than it does during a casual afternoon basketball game. Still, putting together what he'd seen and heard that night with his memory of the daytime visitor, Key reached a conclusion that gave investigators another thread, one that led straight back to Dale, a man the family had considered nothing more than a familiar face around the house. Facing the weight of the evidence against him, Dimitri Dale confessed. He didn't just describe his own role. He agreed to keep cooperating, including recording a conversation with Yuri that later played a decisive part in the case against him. For a man who, up to that point, had figured into the case as little more than a neighbor and family acquaintance who'd driven the shooter to the house, agreeing to cooperate meant a complete break from the earlier version of events and an admission of his own hand in setting up the attack. Alongside the family's efforts, Palm Beach County Police ran their own outreach for tips from the community, using the Palm Beach County Crime Stoppers line, an anonymous channel residents could use to share information without the risk of being publicly named as a source. The case drew significant local news coverage within days of the murder, and tips apparently came in steadily throughout the investigation. But as far as available sources indicate, none of them proved decisive. The key evidence in this case came from investigators' own legwork, not a lucky tip from outside. For neighbors and acquaintances, the months between the murder and the first arrests turned into a stretch of uncertainty and rumor. The story of a pregnant entrepreneur shot in her sleep just hours after posting about her own success had already drawn significant regional attention before the real circumstances of the crime were known. The county stayed, on the surface, a quiet suburb. But for the people who actually knew the family, the wait to find out who killed Macka and why stretched on for months. The arrests didn't happen all at once. They were spread out over time.
19-year-old Jovan Joseph is charged with first-degree murder in Jenkins' death.
This person took a life.
The first, in September 2017, was Jovan Joseph, the man who'd actually pulled the trigger in Macka's bedroom. Yuri Jenkins was arrested later, in December of that same year, nearly 6 months after his wife's death. For all that time, he kept living what looked, on the surface, like an ordinary life, working, raising the kids who were left with him, appearing in public as a father of 3 who'd lost their mother. Demetri Dale, by that point, had already left Florida. He was picked up by U.S. Marshals in North Carolina on a warrant tied to a first-degree murder charge. The U.S. Marshals typically get involved in manhunts when a suspect crosses state lines trying to escape local jurisdiction. By the time Yuri Jenkins was arrested, the masked robber story he'd been telling police and the press from day one had completely fallen apart under the weight of the evidence against him. The man who'd appeared before cameras as a devastated widower was now one of the primary suspects in the murder of his own pregnant wife. He'd spent 6 months as a free man between his wife's death and his own arrest. 6 months during which the story he told in those first hours kept unraveling, piece by piece, under the pressure of a found receipt, surveillance footage, cell phone records, and statements from people he'd once considered his accomplices.
Well, jury selection is underway in a high-profile murder case in our area. The jury will have to decide if Yuri Jenkins paid a hitman to murder his wife Macka Jenkins 5 years ago.
The path from Yuri Jenkins's arrest to his trial turned out to be a long one, far longer than you'd expect, given how much evidence had been collected against him. The first attempt at a trial began in January 2020, more than 2 years after his arrest. It fell apart on the second day of jury selection, when prospective jurors reported hearing the victim's mother publicly discussing the defendant's guilt inside the courthouse before the jury had even been finalized. The judge had no choice but to dismiss the entire jury pool and start the selection process over from scratch, with an entirely new group of candidates, effectively pushing the trial back indefinitely. A second trial never happened at all. It was cancelled because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which paralyzed Florida's court system, like most courts nationwide, for an extended stretch. Criminal jury trials across the state were postponed one after another during that period, and Yuri Jenkins's case was no exception. It's worth noting, the state officially decided not to pursue the death penalty against Yuri Jenkins, even though a first-degree murder charge with aggravating circumstances, a murder for hire, committed for financial gain, technically gave prosecutors the option to consider it. So even before the third and final trial began, it was already clear the maximum possible sentence, if he was convicted, would be life in prison. The third trial opened with opening statements in late April 2022 in Palm Beach County Court, almost 5 years after Macka's murder. By then, her kids had grown up considerably, and the case had shifted from a fresh tragedy into something a lot of people in the county only vaguely remembered.
Yes,
Go right ahead, ma'am.
I just want to say to everybody, this has been a long struggle for me.
For Macka's family, her grandmother, her brothers, other relatives, those 5 years meant living through 3 separate cycles, preparing for trial, watching it collapse, and waiting again for the next shot at justice. The prosecution was led by Alexia Cox and Richard Closey. Yuri's defense was handled by attorney Greg Lerman. The 2 central witnesses for the prosecution were the men whose own confessions had built the case in the first place, Jovan Joseph and Demetri Dale. Joseph told the jury he'd bought the gun used in the murder for just $60, a number that starkly undersold the scale of what that purchase would end up costing. He described the whole plan as a money play and admitted in court that he'd agreed to kill Macka for $20,000, with $10,000 paid up front. Those numbers didn't match what he'd told investigators right after his arrest, when he'd said the payment was $1,500. That gap, between $1,500 and $20,000, later became one of the defense's central arguments. If he'd lied about how much he was paid to commit murder, How much of the rest of his testimony could actually be trusted? Daventry Dale, the second key witness, testified that Yuri Jenkins was the one who set the whole thing in motion. In his words, no one would ever have thought to hurt Macka if the plan hadn't come directly from her own husband. That single point became the backbone of the prosecution's entire case. Without the involvement of a man who knew Macka better than anyone else, Joseph and Dale had no reason to target her at all. No personal motive, no insight into the family's finances, no knowledge of her daily routine. Prosecutor Cox drew the jury's attention to one more detail. 28 days before Macka's death, one of her insurance policies had been changed, a detail that tied Yuri's financial motive to a specific point on the timeline before the murder, turning an abstract motive about money into a concrete piece of chronological evidence. Among the other evidence, prosecutors played the jury an audio recording of that incriminating conversation between Dale and Yuri, recorded by Dale after he'd started cooperating with investigators, a recording that, prosecutors argued, contained language directly pointing to Yuri's knowledge of the planned murder. The forensic side of the case came from Palm Beach County Fire Rescue, Captain Dia Amiro, and crime scene investigator Julianne Brandt, who testified about the nature of Macka's wound and the blood evidence recovered at the scene, backing up the witness testimony with hard physical evidence. The trial wasn't without an emotional outburst.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have been advised that the jury has reached a verdict. Now, I know that we have a lot of friends and family.
During the proceedings, Macka's younger brother, Marquavius Greer, called as a prosecution witness, lost control at the sight of Yuri sitting at the defense table and tried to lunge at him right there in the courtroom. Wenabomba the Sonda Sabati, a moment that required immediate intervention from courtroom security. Deputies intercepted him and removed him from the room. The judge, addressing what happened, called the outburst completely unacceptable inside a courtroom and demanded that everyone present keep their composure for the rest of the trial.
That nobody loses their composure in front of our jury and shouts out, does anything like that.
Throughout the entire trial, Yuri Jenkins never testified in his own defense, a decision defendants make for all kinds of reasons, but one that juries often read as, at best, ambiguous. His defense built its entire strategy around discrediting Joseph's and Dale's testimony, without ever offering the jury an alternative account of that night from Yuri himself. Jury selection for the third trial, informed by how badly the first attempt had fallen apart, was handled with much closer attention to what candidates might have heard or discussed outside the courtroom. A clear lesson learned from the 2020 mistrial. The trial itself, which began in late April, stretched on for several weeks, with prosecution and defense witnesses cycling through, the jury absorbing dozens of hours of testimony, reviewing forensic findings, and watching surveillance footage that had already been part of the case since the investigative stage. The defense's core strategy centered on attacking the credibility of the prosecution's own witnesses. Both Joseph and Dale had received reduced sentences in exchange for testifying against Yuri, and both, as already noted, had given investigators conflicting versions of events at different points. Defense attorney Lerman used cross-examination repeatedly to point the jury toward those inconsistencies, trying to build doubt about whether the word of people willing to change their story to shorten their own sentence could be trusted at all. The prosecution, for its part, argued that on the one point that mattered most, that Yuri had set the murder in motion and promised to pay for it. Both witnesses' testimony at trial lined up, and it was that consistency, not the smaller contradictions in the details, that should carry the most weight with the jury. Jury deliberations took less than 3 hours, an unusually short amount of time for a case that had dragged on for 5 years and included testimony from dozens of witnesses, forensic analysis, and audio recordings. On May 6, 2022, the jury delivered its verdict. Yuri Jenkins was found guilty of first-degree murder. Judge Kirk Volker handed down the legally mandated sentence that same day, life in prison without the possibility of parole, and ordered Yuri to pay $568 in court costs. Under Florida law, that sentence for first-degree murder isn't up to judicial discretion. It's a direct requirement of the law. The only alternative would have been the death penalty, which prosecutors had already taken off the table before the third trial even started. Yuri Jenkins is serving his life sentence at Century Correctional Institution in the town of Century, at the very northern tip of Florida. hundreds of miles from Palm Beach County, where the murder happened. The sentence wasn't the end of his efforts to fight the outcome. Yuri appealed the verdict, with attorney Tim Rodriguez representing him. On December 20th, 2023, Florida's 4th District Court of Appeal, reviewing the case under docket number 4, D22-1423, upheld the conviction. In a 5-page ruling written by Judge Spencer Levine, the testimony from Dale and Joseph was described as compelling evidence. For Yuri Jenkins, that closed off his legal options entirely. No retrial, no release. Jovan Joseph, the man who shot Macka that night, had already pleaded guilty to second-degree murder back in July 2019, in exchange for cooperating with investigators and later testifying against Yuri at trial. He was sentenced to 15 years, with credit for nearly 5 years already spent in custody awaiting trial, followed by 10 years of probation. He's serving his time at Quincy Correctional Institution, with release expected in 2032. While incarcerated, Joseph picked up an additional charge for possessing a homemade shank, an episode that added to his overall sentence after the main case had already been decided. Daventry Dale, the man who introduced Yuri to Joseph and drove the shooter to the house the night of the murder, pleaded guilty to manslaughter. He received a 45-day jail sentence, of which he actually served 15 days, plus 15 years of probation with electronic monitoring. In April 2022, shortly before the final trial against Yuri began, where Dale served as a key prosecution witness, he was arrested for violating the terms of that probation. Of the 3 men involved in Macka's murder, Dale, the middleman and driver, walked away with the lightest legal punishment of all, even though his testimony played a decisive role in convicting the man who orchestrated the whole thing. Macka's 3 children were left without their mother. On the day the jury handed down its guilty verdict against their father, one of her daughters was celebrating her 6th birthday.
Because my great-granddaughter's birthday is today, and we had so many plans for his daughter.
Another daughter graduated from high school just weeks later. 2 milestones that are usually family celebrations instead played out in the shadow of a murder trial, without their mother there to see them. The family's reaction to how the case ended was mixed in tone, but unified underneath it. Quay Greer, the brother who was in the house the night of the murder and made one of the 911 calls, later said he'd cried so many tears he didn't have any left, but that he tries to stay strong wherever he goes, for his sister's sake. Marquavius Greer, the younger brother whose attempt to go after Yuri in the courtroom had to be stopped by deputies, described what happened as an extremely cruel, extremely selfish crime. A short line that captured exactly how the whole family saw it. Not just a calculated murder, but a betrayal by someone who'd been part of their family for years.
I wanted was justice for my child, and nobody wins in this case.
Macka's grandmother, Gloria Harold, told the court in her own statement that it had been a long fight that touched her entire family and that she held no personal grudge against Yuri, while making clear there were no winners in this case, that she'd only ever wanted justice for her child and that all she wanted now was peace for herself, her family, and Macka's children.
To find peace now, because I feel like my child will have peace from here on in, and all I ever wanted was to find peace.
Notably, it was Gloria Harold, not Yuri, who was actually the beneficiary of the insurance policy that had motivated the murder in the first place, which gave her words about peace and there being no winners even more weight. Defense attorney Greg Lerman said after the verdict that he was shocked by the outcome, arguing that it was the 2 accomplice witnesses, not his client, who'd actually committed the crime, and that convicting someone based on what he called clearly false testimony was unacceptable. Palm Beach County State Attorney Dave Arenberg, on the other hand, thanked the jury for its work, saying the prosecution believed Macka Jenkins deserved justice and that the jury's verdict delivered it.
We have to get that justice. He has to be convicted of this murder, and that would give some closure.
Macka Jenkins' case drew extensive coverage in local and national media over the years, from the earliest reports of a deadly robbery in the summer of 2017 to the final verdict in 2022. The story was covered by CBS 12, WPTV, and WEAR-TV, along with the Palm Beach Post, People, Oxygen, and the NY Daily News. It later became the basis for an episode of a true crime documentary series. Evidence that the story reached well beyond regional interest becoming part of a broader conversation about crimes committed within families for money. One particularly influential piece of that coverage was the interview Yuri gave CBS 12 the day after the murder. Legal experts later noted that prosecutors were able to use that footage at trial without restriction, while the defense could only use it in Yuri's favor if he agreed to testify himself, something he never did. That recorded public grief, which prosecutors later contrasted with evidence of his private behavior, became part of the overall picture presented to the jury. Despite the conviction, and despite it being upheld on appeal, several aspects of this case remain unresolved or were simply never fully closed. The proportionality of the sentences still raises questions. The man who orchestrated the murder got life in prison. The man who pulled the trigger got 15 years. And the man who arranged the meeting between them and physically drove the shooter to the house ended up serving 15 days. All three carry different degrees of responsibility for the same crime, but a gap that wide in sentencing reflects the value prosecutors placed on cooperation more than it reflects the severity of what each man actually did. The legal system rewarded whoever was willing to talk, not necessarily whoever bore the least responsibility. One separate question that's never been resolved is the fate of the unborn child. The murder took 2 lives in the most literal sense, but neither Yuri nor Joseph ever faced a separate charge tied specifically to the death of the fetus. That part of the crime never received its own legal reckoning. Macka Jenkins went from homelessness to running her own business, raised 3 kids, was expecting a 4th, and in the final hours of her life, posted online that anyone can change their life if they're determined enough. She was killed in her own bed by people she either loved or had let into her home as her husband's acquaintances. The children she left behind did nothing to deserve losing her, just as she did nothing to deserve dying at the hands of a man she trusted with her life and the lives of her family. The community that followed this case for almost 7 years didn't remember Macka as a name in court filings. They remembered her as a woman whose story was supposed to end a completely different way. And that leaves one last question for anyone who's watched this video. When someone close to you sees your success, do they see you, or do they just see the money?
It's everything about it. The conversations with her, she just was a person, the kind of person you would never want to go on living with.